Hello, I'm Trevor, and in this video I'm going to be talking about my podcast, Workshop Waffle. You can find it on iTunes or on my website, trevorsworkshop.com. So what do I talk about on the podcast? Well, I talk mostly about woodworking and sometimes just about making things. I watch a lot of YouTube videos, I listen to all the podcasts myself, I read a lot of magazines, so sometimes I have some opinions as well, and the podcast is really my avenue for discussing those thoughts and opinions. In addition to talking about woodworking, I also highlight a few choice videos. If you're familiar with David Picciuto, aka The Drunken Woodworker, then you are already familiar with his show, the Weekly Wrap-Up Show, in which he highlights news and videos from around the woodworking community during the week. This is not what I do. I tend to focus in on those gems of videos, which I think are videos that don't have a lot of traction in the woodworking community simply because they're not just solely about woodworking, but they do have some relation to woodworking, and that's why I talk about them. An example of a video I recently highlighted is the Adam Savage one-day build video, in which Adam Savage builds a replica of Barbarella's space rifle. You're probably more familiar with Adam Savage from his role on Mythbusters, but he does do a one-day build video in which he builds something and he takes you through the process from design through to drawing out a plan, constructing and finishing the product. In this particular video, he builds a replica of Barbarella's space rifle from nothing but a photograph of Jane Fonda standing next to the rifle. He shows how he uses the height of Jane Fonda to measure the length of the rifle, and he shows how he draws out a plan and then takes you through the entire construction process. It is a fairly long video, but is really worthwhile watching, and there's a lot of tips and techniques that as a woodworker you can pick up and use in your own projects. Another project I highlighted was the Senior 20 organ build project by Ronald Walters. The Senior 20 organ is not an actual physical musical instrument organ that you play, but I think it can be classed as a musical instrument in that it does play a tune or a melody by following a string of notes depicted on a music roll. Ron has done a wonderful job of reconstructing one of these machines, and he takes you through his build process and also shows some of those items or areas where he had trouble, and he shows how he overcomes them and really gives you a lot of good tips and techniques if the Senior 20 organ is something that you want to build yourself. So watch the videos, they're incredibly interesting, and perhaps they'll also inspire you to build such a device. I myself have become pretty inspired by those videos and actually considered building one of those at some point in time. Outside of talking about woodworking and highlighting a few choice videos, I also talk a lot about projects that appear in woodworking magazines. I subscribe to pretty much all the US-based woodworking magazines, and for me that's a little bit of a learning experience. I find sometimes the best way to learn how to do something is to look how other people do it. Look at their design process, look how they construct things. Are there any tips and techniques I can pick up that I can perhaps apply to my own projects? In episode 12 of Workshop Waffle, I highlighted my top projects or my favorite projects from all the woodworking magazines for 2014. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to highlight just the top or my favorite project from each of those magazines for 2014. I'm going to start off with Woodcraft magazine, and my favorite project from Woodcraft magazine was the surfboard wall shelf by Jim Harold. And that was featured in the June-July issue of Woodcraft magazine. When you look at this project, you'll probably ask me, why did I choose such a simple project as my favorite project? Well, sometimes a project doesn't have to be complicated to be a good project. In this case, Jim has done a wonderful job of building a wall shelf, but doing it in a really innovative and creative way. I just love the way he's laminated the woods together, and the whole concept of having a surfboard on the wall as a shelf is really great and fantastic. It's a beautiful project, the outcome is beautiful, and it's really worthwhile having a look at that project if that's something you're considering doing, building a wall shelf. From Woodsmith magazine, my favorite project for the year was the Cherry Dining Table from issue 216. This is, again, it's a fairly simple project to build, but it's really a beautiful design, well worth checking out. And incidentally, there's a companion project in the same issue for the matching chairs. The chairs and the table are two very big projects in themselves. The chairs probably being the more complex project to build, and because you have to build a number of them, obviously the longer to build. But the project itself is wonderful. The design is beautiful. It's definitely my best or my favorite project from Woodsmith magazine for the year. My favorite project for Shop Notes magazine came from issue 136, and that's the workbench rail system. I loved the extra functionality that it would add to my workbench, but after debating with myself whether I wanted to add it or not add it, I decided not to add it because I thought that the rail system would interfere with the solid end of my workbench. I didn't want that gap between the rail system and the workbench. Now, you can add the rail system on and take it off, but I just found that if I had to add it to my workbench, the first time I'd take it off because I wanted that solid end, I probably would just not add it back to my workbench and it would just sit somewhere in my workshop. But after thinking about it for some time, I've come up with a way where I could still retain a solid edge and add a similar rail system. So I'm going to be talking about that on my podcast, so subscribe to my podcast and you can hear a little bit about my plans for that. Moving on to American Woodworker magazine. In September 2014, Popular Woodworking acquired American Woodworker, so American Woodworker is no longer published, which is a great pity because this was one of my favorite magazines and I really used to look forward to receiving this magazine. But my favorite project from this magazine comes from the May issue, and that's the Portable Workbench by Yoav Lieberman. And this is very similar to the Milkman's workbench that Chris Schwarz highlighted in Popular Woodworking during 2014. But this is a more modern take on that, and this can be used as a workbench to use in an area where perhaps you don't have a workshop, so you work indoors, so you could use it on your dining room table, for example, or you can also use it in your workbench to actually elevate a piece off your worktop. So it's really a worthwhile project looking into, especially if you don't have a workshop and you want to begin woodworking. This is a really great take on that Milkman's workbench, so check it out. From Woodworker's Journal, my absolute favorite project for the year was the accordion style lamp, and that is by Charles Mack and Lars Parrington. Now, before I talk about that, it's worth noting that the whole accordion mechanism and also some of those design elements are all from Ronald Walters. He published a video on his YouTube channel a couple of years ago in which he detailed this accordion style mechanism. And in fact, the authors of this article also highlight that in the article. They give him credit for that mechanism. But if this is something you want to build, I'd strongly recommend you check out Ronald Walters' YouTube channel. He has all the elements and how to construct that accordion mechanism, and that is a good companion for this article. So check both of them out, the accordion wall lamp from Woodworker's Journal, April issue, and also Ronald Walters' YouTube channel. We now come to Popular Woodworking. And my favorite project for Popular Woodworking also happens to be my second most favorite project for the year. And that is the Illusion Cabinet by Gary Rogowski. When you look at the cabinet itself, there's nothing very special about it. The part I like most about this design is the door. It's a frame and panel type design, but it's not a traditional frame and panel door. The stiles taper from a thick part to a thin part, and while the rails also taper from a thick part to a thin part, they also have an arc cut into them. Constructing the door is probably a tricky process, and the author does highlight that and also gives you some tips and tricks for actually constructing and gluing up these doors. Moving along to my last magazine I'm going to review, Wood Magazine. My favorite project from Wood Magazine also is my favorite project overall for the entire 2014. The project I rated most favorite for me is the High Style Hutch by John Olson, and it appeared in the November issue of Wood Magazine. John has done a wonderful job of detailing how to construct this High Style Hutch. It looks like a very complex design, but he actually lays it out in a way that you can construct this very easily. The part I like most about this design are that the legs are tapered and they face into the frame at 45 degrees. This is a really worthwhile project. There's a lot of technique in this article, and as I say, John has laid out the article in a lot of detail and can help probably even a beginner construct this hutch. That wraps it up for the magazines. I also subscribe to Fine Woodworking. I did not rate a project from that because I only started subscribing towards the end of the year. And in fact, the first issue I received was the August issue. If I had to choose a favorite project from August to December, I'd probably say it's the garden chair that appeared in that August issue. However, if you look at the front page, that's the featured article, which is the garden chair. This is a two-part article of which the first part appears in June. So if you have a look at that garden chair and you decide that's something you want to build, then you'll need to get the June issue as well as the August issue. Okay, so those were my favorite projects for 2014. I listed many more favorite projects and good projects worth looking at, and you can find that in episode 12 of Workshop Waffle. Coming up for the next couple of months, or weeks at least, I'm going to be reviewing a whole bunch of woodworking magazines. I'm going to start in the next episode, which should release February 6th, with the Woodsmith Guild Edition. Now, what I found out is that Woodsmith and Shop Notes have merged together. They used to be the same publication, I think, but they've just combined those magazines into one now, and that's going to be called Woodsmith Guild Edition. And I believe the first issue is free for download, so I'll put a link in the show notes below, so check that out. I'm not sure how long it's going to be free for, but check that out. Go to the link, download the magazine if you can. I'm going to be talking about that in my next issue. The featured article is the mortising machine, so I have some opinions on that. So check out next Workshop Waffle for what I think about that project. That's it. I'm going to try and do one of these video waffles every month or so. But for now, that's it. Please rate, subscribe, and check my podcast out on iTunes or trevorsworkshop.com. Thank you, and bye-bye.